Good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery Team and partners, I would like to welcome you to our webinar on the Landfire project and how it can be applied in the Great Basin, presented by Kori Blankenship and Louis Provencher from the Nature Conservancy. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let you know that you may ask questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions pane of your control panel at the top right of your screen. I will field questions for Kori and Louis after the presentation, but if you have technical questions for me, I can respond by text at any time. I will show up as the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. Now I would like to introduce our presenters. Kori Blankenship is a fire ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Bend, Oregon. Kori was a GIS specialist at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory and a wildland firefighter in Washington and Colorado for the National Park Service and the Forest Service. Currently, she works with the Landfire project to apply the processes and products toward addressing conservation challenges on large landscapes and ecosystems. Louis Provencher has been the Director of Conservation Ecology of the Nature Conservancy in Nevada since January 2002. Louis came to fire ecology through his position as a research ecologist for the longleaf pine restoration project at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, in the 90s and early 2000s. Currently, he is responsible for Nevada and cross-boundary projects that include remote sensing, state and transition modeling, and implementing climate change effects into landscape conservation forecasting, to name a few. Welcome, Kori and Louis, and thank you for being here today. And you know what? I just realized that I did not have my my waiting room screen showing during that, so I apologize. So here it is briefly right before I transfer the presentation over to Kori.
Great. Thanks, Jeannie.
You're welcome.
Can you see my screen?
I just transferred the power over to you, so we should in just a minute.
Okay.
There we go.
Let me know when you. Okay, wonderful. Great. Well, let's get going. Louis and I are here to talk about landfire data and its application along with local data in the Great Basin. And Jeannie did a great job of giving you a short introduction to Louis and I, and here you can put a face with the name. I also want to introduce the folks shown at the bottom of the screen who are members of the Nature Conservancy's Landfire team who I work with, Randy Swati, Jeannie Patton, Sarah Hagen, and Jim Smith, and those folks all helped develop this presentation as well. So Louis and I, what we want to talk about today is first to go over some basics of landfire so that we're all on the same page about what the project is. And then I want to spend most of my time focusing on how we've updated and improved the products over time. Then I'll touch briefly on how you can use landfire data and local data in conjunction. And then for the last 10 minutes or so, Louis is going to talk to you about some of the great work he's done all across the Great Basin using local data sets where they're available and landfire data to do what he calls landscape conservation forecasting. So let's jump right into the basics here. Landfire is a shared project between the Forest Service and the Department of Interior. And the Nature Conservancy, who I work for, is a partner on that project. Landfire was funded because there was a lack of data to support regional and national fire program analyses, and Congress funded us as a way to provide the data that could support that kind of informed decision-making. So the Landfire project, to sum it up, two highlights of what we do is that we produce continuous and consistent data. So that's 30-meter raster spatial data that's delivered wall-to-wall for the entire country, regardless of ownership. And we create that data using a consistent methodology so that you can compare areas in Alaska to the Midwest to the Southeast. So those two characteristics make Landfire fairly unique and valuable for large-scale applications. In addition, all that data is served for free online, so it's available for anybody who wants it. This is a list of Landfire spatial data products. There are over 20 grid layers, and again, they're all at that 30-meter cell size. The data products can be divided up into 4 major categories: vegetation, fire regimes, fuel, and disturbance. Now, if you haven't stayed tuned to all the changes that have been going on with Landfire lately, this disturbance category may be new to you. That's something that we didn't deliver in our original product suite, but as we've gone through and provided updates to our products over time, we had to develop these set of disturbance products, and so now we deliver those as well. I want to just highlight a couple items under the vegetation category, because one of the great things about Landfire is that it uses the same legend to map 3 different vegetation concepts. And this is something that's fairly valuable. So first, we map something, well, we map existing vegetation, which is what's on the ground today. Then we map something called environmental site potential, which is the vegetation type you would expect given the climate. And then we map biophysical settings, which is the vegetation you would expect given climate and an approximation of the historical disturbance regime. So those 3 layers in combination give you 3 different ways to look at the vegetation on a site and what it can support. Now, in addition to all this spatial data, Landfire creates what it calls vegetation dynamics models. And these are state and transition models that quantify rates and pathways for succession and the probability of disturbance for each biophysical setting. And these models represent pre-settlement reference conditions. Now, if you're someone who's not really interested in learning new models, you should know that there's a description document that goes with each of these models that describes the system, describes the historical disturbance regime, the geographic range, species list. So it's a really great resource on pre-settlement reference conditions for all the vegetation types that we map in the country. And in the Landfire process, we use these models to set that reference condition that we can compare to the current vegetation condition and calculate vegetation condition class. And as you're going to see later when I hand it over to Louis, these models can be adapted to represent current conditions that then you can use to model out future conditions. Now, Landfire has several major versions that are available now, and the first set was what we call Landfire National. That was our full suite of products, and that was delivered in about 2009. And since then, we've had 2 major updates. In 2001, we applied a set of systematic improvements and some new methodologies for some of the existing vegetation types to improve that set of national products. And then in 2008, we added disturbance and succession information to bring the data up to that circa 2008 condition. So probably in those situations, you're going to just want to use the latest Landfire data, which is now the Landfire 2008. But I wanted, or I'll spend some time discussing the changes that have been made so you can understand how the data have evolved over time. The next release for Landfire is going to be the Landfire 2010 product, which is scheduled for delivery in the spring and summer of this year. So first of all, I'll go over some of the improvements that were made for Landfire 2001. One of the big improvements we made was to change the methods to improve forest cover and forest height mapping. In the western states, we remapped biophysical settings. We did something called grouping BTSs, which I'll explain more about in just a minute. And we changed some of the methods for calculating condition class. Now, these first 4 things I'm going to go into more detail in later slides. And the next 3 I'm just going to touch on here so that you're aware that these changes have taken place. And if you're interested, we can talk more about that at the end. We created what we call burnable agriculture in Landfire National. agricultural lands never had burnable fuel models applied to them, and because of user feedback, we changed that in certain situations. We also adjusted our international boundary to match that of other international boundary data sets, and we incorporated the final National Land Cover Data Set 2001 product. Some of our existing vegetation classes we take straight from that National Land Cover Data Set, things like water and urban, for example. Okay, so now I want to get into some of the details about what we actually changed. We changed methods for calculating forest cover in response to user feedback that tree canopy cover was generally too high. And so the new methodology that was developed is based on mining information out of forest inventory and analysis plots. And before I show you the result of that change, I want you to notice the extent of this particular map. This is called the Southwest Geo Area, and it covers most of the Great Basin, although not all of it, as well as a large part of the Southwest. And so in the next table that I'm going to show you, it's summarizing information across this whole geographic area. So the result of this change in forest cover, if you look at the percent change column in the far right, is basically a shifting of cover from the higher classes to the lower cover classes. So you see a big increase in that 20 to 30% canopy cover and a decrease in all of those higher level canopy cover classes. And this change is expected to align better with the values expected for fire behavior modeling. Similarly, we changed the method for mapping forest height to incorporate user feedback and additional data sources. And again, you see a similar result here, a shifting of forest height from the lowest height classes to the higher height classes. And this new height map should align better, again, with the values that you would expect for fire behavior modeling. And then these changes in cover and height for the existing vegetation get carried through to the fuel models. And so the result is generally more active fire behavior. What you see here is a simulation run in the Wildland Fire Assessment tool. It was run with 98th percentile weather. And what you see again in that percent change column on the far right is that you get longer flame lengths, faster rates of spread, and more crown fire with the Landfire 2001 layers than we did with the Landfire National layers. Now, something that will affect your region to a great extent is the remapping we did of biophysical settings in the rangelands in the west. And so what happened was in Landfire National, we used the STATSCO, or State Soil Geographic data, to inform the mapping of biophysical settings. And when we went back in 2001, we used the finer scale SURVO, or Soil Survey Geographic data, for mapping BTS. Okay, now on to this grouping process that I mentioned earlier. For the 2001 products, it was determined that there was too much variation in the reference condition model set. And so we undertook this grouping process to reduce the number of models. And this is an example of how that might work. So these are 3 ponderosa pine systems that Landfire mapped. And what it did is it chose one to represent these 3 types. And so it was given a new name, Ponderosa Pine 1. And this particular model then is applied to anywhere you would have found any of these 3 ponderosa pine types originally. Now, this is important because these reference conditions go into all of Landfire's fire regime groups maps. And so by changing the model, you can have changes downstream in your succession class map, your vegetation condition class map, the fire regime groups, and the historical fire regime maps. Now, that grouping was meant to deal with what, in some cases, was too much variation in the BTS models. But what we found is that in some cases, that grouping might have gone too far, and we've ended up applying models and reference conditions in areas where they don't really fit. And so for Landfire 2010, the next iteration, the plan is to go back to deriving the suite of maps from the original DTS models. So we're doing away with the groups, and now the onus will be on the user to group biophysical settings as they see fit, if you need to for your particular landscape and application. Okay, and finally, in this set of 2001 changes and improvements, we made some changes to the fire regime products. First of all, we changed some terminology. We used to map fire regime condition class, and we're mapping the same thing, but we're now calling it vegetation condition class. And the reason for that is that we've never mapped or we've never measured changes in fire regimes. We've only ever really measured the changes in the vegetation, cover, height, and composition. And so this change in terminology just better reflects what it is that we're actually mapping, which is the condition of the vegetation. We also made some changes in the reference condition having to do with groups, and we made some changes in the summary unit. We used to summarize vegetation departure across broad ecological subsections, and now we're using hydrologic unit codes, or HUCs, for our summary units. And that is important because for those of you who are familiar with vegetation condition class, or FRCC, it's a scale-dependent metric, as you know, and so when you change that summary unit, you can actually change the value you get, even if you have the same input data. Okay, so that brings us up to Landfire 2008. What Landfire 2008 did is it took all those improvements that were in 2001, and to those products, it applied information about disturbances and succession to bring our maps up to a circa 2008 condition. And so we used a change detection process to identify change in Landsat images. And then we used a number of different additional data sets to try to determine the nature of that change, what caused it, and what type of severity it was. So the additional information that we brought in included things like polygon data that users submitted about where they had done treatments. We mined corporate databases like the Forest Service's FACTS database, and we took information from programs like Modeling Trends and Burn Severity to determine fire severity. And all that information then was used to update the products to determine what would be on the landscape in about circa 2008. So as you can see from this map that covers the Great Basin, the primary disturbance mapped in your area was fire. So this information, this disturbance information, along with information about growth rates, was then used to update all the Landfire maps. Now, in 2010, we're using a similar process to update the maps, but we've changed our change detection process, and that should improve change detection in the non-forest areas. So you should see a better detection of areas of change in areas like the Great Basin that are largely dominated by non-forest types. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about using Landfire data, and specifically I was asked to address the issue of accuracy. And unfortunately, the accuracy or agreement assessment for Landfire 2001 and 2008 data is not complete. So what I have on the screen here is a bit of information taken from the Landfire National Agreement Assessment. So it is updated, but I want to use it just to illustrate some concepts about what you should be looking for when looking at the accuracy assessment and trying to determine if these data are good enough for your application. So this table is summarizing data for what's called the Great Basin Superzone, which you see in that little map. The area labeled as the Great Basin. It's a fairly broad area, and that's what's being summarized here in the table. There are various ways to look at agreement, but for our purposes today, I'm just going to focus on this right-hand column called User Agreement. And that is the percent of holdout plots, and holdout plots are plots that we take out of our mapping process so then we can use them later in accuracy assessment. So it's the number of holdout, or the percent of holdout plots mapped as a given class that are actually that class according to the reference data. And to look at it a different way, it's, or in mathematical terms, it's the plots with agreement. You can see that column there in the middle, divided by the mapped plots. And so the trend I want you to notice here is that there's a great variation in the agreement for different vegetation types. So at the top of the table, you see Great Basin juniper woodland, or pinyon juniper woodland, and the agreement is relatively high, 82%. But if you go about 2/3 of the way down, Great Basin xeric mixed sagebrush shrubland has an agreement of 20%. There are a lot of factors that go into mapping accuracy, and one of those is that it's generally easier to map forest types because we tend to have more plot data to drive the mapping in those areas. And so you tend to get better agreement in forest areas. And then there are a number of problems associated with these kinds of accuracy assessments. For example, we don't always have that many holdout plots for these agreement assessments, and the plots that we do have aren't evenly distributed. We don't even have plots for certain classes. And so what I want you to take away is that there's going to be variation in how well different types are mapped, and there's going to be geographic variation in how well different types are mapped based on things like how many plots we have for them. So the agreement assessment that Landfire provides and will be providing for the newer products, the 2008 and the 2001, is certainly one piece of information for evaluating these data, but I think it's really important for users to take the time to review the area for the specific landscape they're working on, because the agreement assessment probably won't give you all the information you'd like to have for the particular part of the world that you're working in. Now, because we think it's important to review and modify Landfire data, we've developed some guides to help people do that and some tools. So the first two things listed here are how-to user guides for reviewing the Landfire models and the spatial data. So that's a great sort of self-guided resource for taking a look at our data. Then through the National Interagency Fuels and Vegetation Technology Transfer Team, there are some tools that have been developed to modify the spatial data in ARC. And then finally, we have real people that can help you. Landfire offers support through the Nature Conservancy's Landfire team, who I work with, and then that nifty team, National Interagency Fuels and Technology Transfer Team. And our information is on the Landfire website, so you can get in touch with us. Before I turn it over to Louis, I want to leave you with some take-home messages for my part. First, Landfire is a comprehensive source of fire and vegetation-related data for the entire U.S. And even though it's produced for national and regional level purposes, we've seen that it's had great utility at finer scales for conservation, fire, and land management type work. And we'll be the first to encourage you to use your own local data if you have it. But often we find that there are gaps in local data sets, or it doesn't cover your entire extent, or perhaps all the themes of information that you need. And so in those cases, if you do turn to Landfire, we encourage you to review it and modify it for your needs. Okay, now I'll turn it over to Louis, and he is going to show you how he's applied Landfire data and local data around the Great Basin to inform land management planning. Take it away, Louis.
Okay. So the method that we call landscape conservation forecasting was developed actually in Nevada, so that's good news for us. The stars on the map of the U.S. here represent the projects where this method's been applied at landscape scale. And our interest has always been to help managers plan restoration of large landscapes at cost. So most of the work that I've done with others has been with with the Forest Service, the BLM, National Park Service, and in many of those cases, there were private landowners who have inholdings or major significant inholdings who are involved in the projects too. But it's basically to help management. And we go beyond the reference models described by Kori. We actually, all our models are about management and what's going to happen in the future. So quite a few in the Mojave Desert, the Great Basin, and the one out east is in the Cherokee National Forest. That's one application that we have there with the Forest Service and a bunch of other partners. Okay, Kori. For the Great Basin, we have two types of projects. We have projects where we use directly the Landfire data, and we may update it with other layers. For example, we use Eric Peterson's from the Nevada Natural Heritage Program. He did a cheatgrass index map a few years back, and we update the Landfire data with the cheatgrass map to reflect the fact that there's more cheatgrass than was shown in the Landfire data. And we have 3 cases of those that we've done in Nevada. So those are the Cave and Lake Valley Project, the South Spring and Hamblin Valley projects, and the Steptoe Valley units B and C. Steptoe Valley is just gigantic. It's Ely, the town of Ely. Those who are familiar is in Steptoe Valley. And it's split in 3 sections, and we did planning with the BLM on 2 sections. In all those 3 cases, this was for the watershed assessment process, and we used the Landfire data. They could not afford at that scale doing their own local remote sensing. My preference is to do our own local remote sensing. I do that with a contractor, Spatial Solutions. And the other projects we have there is that we actually went out and mapped vegetation classes that are typically not mapped by Landfire, mostly the uncharacteristic classes. So this is where we develop the full range of state and transition models with all the classes, all these classes that are caused by humans mucking around with the vegetation. So we call them uncharacteristic classes, and we map a great deal of those in addition to all the reference classes. So it allows us to do very precise management of, or plan for very precise management of certain class of vegetation, but not others, should we want to do that. And those projects include the Bodie Hills, where with the Bishop BLM, that's in California, Great Basin National Park, the Grouse Creek Craft River Mountain, Northwest Utah, Hamblin Valley and Black Mountains, an ongoing project with the Cedar City BLM, the Pine Valley Ranger District, that's with the Dixie National Forest just south of the Cedar City, and Ward Mountain with the Ely Ranger District and the Ely BLM District. So those are the projects having the Great Basin. We have some in the Sierra and we have some in the Mojave Desert too. Okay, Kori, next slide. The questions the managers ask, or we ask the managers, these projects are all done collaboratively. Nature Conservancy doesn't do this alone. We always work collaboratively with the managers on their landscapes. And the questions that are asked typically are, what is the condition of your landscape? So often we'll talk about vegetation condition class in this case. We have or in our case, we develop a metric that's called ecological departure. What's likely to get worse in the future if you actually continue the current management? So 20 years, 50 years down the road, you can include climate change, but what's going to get worse with your current management? And what you as a manager would do to improve your degraded systems once we identify if some systems are degraded. And as a manager, you may say, let's do prescribed fire here, we're going to do some herbicide mowing there, remove trees there. And the question I'll typically ask you is, do you know that this will actually work, what you're going to do? What is your success rate? What happens if you apply this treatment and there's a drought in the future? So those are the kind of questions we'll probably ask. And often you have to model that to actually know if 20, 50 years down the road you will have succeeded or not. And most importantly, we'll define a series of scenarios. You know, it's like the NEPA alternatives, alternative A, alternative B, and C, and D, and E. And we'll ask of all these alternatives that were proposed, which one has the highest return on investment? So we have a formula that we use to calculate that. So this is generally at the heart of what we do for landscape conservation forecasting. And I'll show you a graph now. Kori, next slide. So this is a schematic. We don't have time to go into the methods. We've actually published on this in the Journal of Conservation Planning in 2010. So the first step is the box with the number 1, where you basically do remote sensing. You either get it from Landfire, or you do your own remote sensing, and you collect data on the ecological system, and then the vegetation class within each ecological system, like mid-successional, or shrubs with an understory of annual grass, or tree and crow shrubland, or something like that. And then we do what we call a single merge, so the class becomes Wyoming sagebrush, tree encroached, or whatever. The second thing is then we build all the models, the management models. These are not the reference models. These are bigger models, and they have all the management and bells and whistles and all the uncharacteristic classes. So we have these models that are prepared with the partners. They review them, so we demystify the model completely. And then we calculate with the data ecological departure. Some people want the vegetation condition class because they have to satisfy certain internal needs for their paperwork and all that. But basically it's a departure from what we call the reference condition, which is, for us, we call that the natural range of variability. From these 3 steps, we then do a management simulations where we simulate a control, and the control is minimum management, where it's basically similar to the do-nothing alternative that you have in NEPA plans, and it's maintain current livestock grazing practices, and maybe most likely maintain your kind of fire suppression activities that you have there. No active management, no spraying of weeds, no fancy fire management, nothing like that. So that's your control, and you actually need this control to calculate return on investment. And then we ask the partners, are there scenarios you want to do in the future, like aggressive manage only doing fire, or aggressive management only doing mechanical method? That's a different scenarios, or a combination of both, or whatever. The limit is the imagination on how your scenarios are defined. And we model those into the future, 20, 50. What will happen to the ecological condition of each ecological system, each biophysical setting, given that you've applied XYZ action, and there are all these natural disturbances. And we introduce variability in these, fire variability, bug attacks, droughts. We actually have done these now with climate change. We include climate change outputs from the climate change models, and we feed them into the software that we use to create progressive warming, transition between ecological systems, and also fertilization of cheatgrass, and whatever you want with it. We do it. And then you get results out of this with the metrics or ecological departure. We have other metrics that we use also, and with those metrics, then we basically show the improvement in the metrics relative to the minimum management, multiplied by the size of each ecological system, divided by the total cost expended over 20 or 50 years, the time of the simulation, and that's your return on investment. And we can tell the managers, you're better off putting your money in this system or this scenario than in this other one. Ultimately, they decide what to do, but we just say, this is what the numbers show. And basically, that's the basic method. You can have wildlife metrics, like if you would want to do sage-grouse habitat suitability metrics, we've done that now. We did it for the desert tortoise. So you can actually embellish this method, but this is the base of the method. Next slide. We have several products that come out of this, and I'm not going to show you all of them, but one product that managers like is this one. This is Great Basin National Park. And we did 50-year simulations with the park, and this is the prescribed fire map, and it's mostly for aspen, higher elevation systems. All the polygons you see, the different colors are different ecological systems, but these are all the polygons they could burn. They don't need to burn all this. They only need to burn a subset of these polygons. But essentially, all of these polygons are vegetations that are candidates for prescribed fire based on the results of our simulations or mapping, that they can pick the ones that are easiest to get or they have the highest priority for some internal reason to Great Basin National Park. One of the things that we like about, the managers love these maps because it tells them where to go manage, basically. But what it also shows where you have economies of scale. You notice that there's different polygons that are side by side, and one is aspen mixed conifer and the other one is aspen subalpine conifer. And the beauty of this is that the managers can light a fire in the mixed conifer, aspen mixed conifer, and let it climb up the hill in the aspen spruce conifer at no great extra cost. And then eventually the fire goes out because it hits the tundra. So it's rock and tundra up there. So this shows economies of scale for the park, and they really like this map in particular. But we can produce a whole number of maps for the mechanical methods, and all of these are associated with, success rates, the budgets, we provide the budgets and all that. So they really like this. Managers really like this kind of information. Next slide. Oh, that's it. Back to you, Kori.
Thanks, Louis. So just to wrap it up here, I'm going to leave some information on the screen where you can go and get more information if you like. All of this stuff, well, a lot of the things that Louis talked about, including some of the landscape conservation reports that he has produced, are on the second website for the Conservation Gateway Landfire site. And then we're utilizing social media with Twitter and YouTube as well to get the word out about what we're doing. So I'll leave this up, and Jeannie, I think we're ready to take questions.
Okay, great. So if you have questions, please type them, and I will field them to Kori and Louis. So Kori, I think the first question is for you. It's from Mark Fries, and he asks, are the vegetation products, e.g. ecological site potential, consistent with the NRCS products, e.g. reference sites?
Largely, yes. But there are some differences. So my understanding is that the NRCS ecological site descriptions tend to be more qualitative, although I also understand that's not always the case. Landfire models are always qualitative, but most of the concepts are very similar. And Louis, I know, has been working on this lately. So Louis, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, the ecological site is a more fine unit than, I'm going to focus on ecological sites, I don't know about the other stuff, is a finer unit than the biophysical setting in many cases. There are cases where the ecological site and the biophysical setting are one and the same. They're the same. But there are some where, for example, the Mount Sagebrush in the Great Basin systems, there's probably at least 4 or 5, if not more, ecological sites that correspond to Mount Sagebrush. Whereas in Landfire, these were all lumped into something that you would call montane sagebrush, intermountain basin montane sagebrush steppe. Similarly, the Great Basin xeric mixed sagebrush is a combination of called dwarf sagebrush, which is low and black sagebrush. And unfortunately, those two are combined because you can't separate them with Landsat imagery or actually at all. You can't separate them. Whereas Landfire, NRCS does split those in two, many sites, but at least there's a clear split between low and black sagebrush. So those are the difference. But basically, the concept of biophysical setting and the concept of ecological site, conceptually, are one and the same pretty much.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully that answered your question, Mark, and if not, feel free to type it in again. All right, Sarah, I'm probably going to say her last name wrong. Lovetang or Lovetang. She asks, are these models done in VDDT pathways?
Yes, great question, and I failed to mention that. So Landfire developed its biophysical settings models in the Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, also known as VDDT. And now VDDT is still available, but it's been superseded by a model called the Path Landscape Model. And the Landfire BPS models can be brought in or imported into Path, so they can be used either in VDDT or Path.
And in my case, I don't use VDDT anymore, except for a simple demonstration where I want it quick and dirty. I only use Path nowadays. So.
Yeah, Path has additional functionality, which is why someone like Louis, a power user, would use that.
Great, thank you. Well, those are all the questions that I have in my little questions panel. If anyone else has any more questions, please type them in. Otherwise, I'll give my little closing spiel. So I wanted to let everyone know that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. And it will also, we will also post it on our Great Basin Fire Science Delivery website within the next few weeks. And if you have more questions regarding this webinar or any other topics, please email me or call me anytime. And I guess that's it for questions. So thank you, Kori and Louis, for your presentation today.
Welcome.
Thanks for listening.
And thank you to our attendees for your participation. Did I say that correctly? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a great day.